The dramatic arc provides a visual representation of the structure of a story. Most novels, plays, and movies will follow this basic structure, and learning scenarios can be organized in this way as well. First, we have exposition. This is the basic information the reader or viewer needs to know in order to understand the story. It includes getting to know who the characters are and when and where the story is taking place. So let's think about a story most people know. How about a Grimm's fairy tale? Hansel and Gretel is a good one. It's got everything: starvation, child abandonment, cannibalism. Recommended reading for children everywhere, right? The exposition at the beginning of the story tells us that a poor woodcutter, his wife, and his two children, Hansel and Gretel, live near a great forest. And they don't have enough to eat. This begins to set the stage for the main conflict. The inciting incident is something that happens to introduce the main conflict, so the tension can build from there as the characters deal with the problem. In the story of Hansel and Gretel, the inciting incident is when stepmom, it's always the stepmom, thinks it's a great idea to take the kids out into the woods and leave them there. So the main conflict, which you can think of as the primary question that has to be resolved in the story, is how are the children going to survive? This leads to the rising action, which builds tension through a series of smaller conflicts and resolutions. In the story of Hansel and Gretel, the children overhear their parents' plan, so Hansel sneaks out and gathers pebbles, which he drops onto their path as they walk. After the parents abandon them in the wood, they are able to follow the pebbles and find their way back home. So this releases some of that tension that was built up. Even though their father is happy to see them, once again the wicked stepmother talks him into getting rid of the children. So it's building back up. It all starts again. Except this time, the stepmother has locked the door so Hansel can't sneak out to gather pebbles. Instead, he throws breadcrumbs. But of course, the birds eat all of the crumbs, so they can't find their way back. Building the tension again. After 3 days with nothing to eat, they find the mother lode. An entire house made of bread, cakes, sugar. An old woman invites them to stay, and she gives them a feast and a comfortable bed to sleep in. That tension is released again. But, as old women in stories often are, this old woman is a wicked witch, and she wants to eat the children. She locks Hansel up and puts Gretel to work helping to fatten the boy up, so building that tension again. She feels his finger every morning to see if he's getting fatter, but he holds a bone out instead, so she can't see. It's releasing a little bit of the tension. After 4 weeks, she gets impatient and decides that the next day she's going to eat him no matter how thin he is. So that's building up again. The witch heats a big oven and tells Gretel to check it. The witch intends to shut her inside the oven, so this builds more tension, which often happens as a story gets closer and closer to the climax. But Gretel suspects something's up, so she pretends to be clueless and asks the witch to show her how to check the oven. The witch isn't near as smart as Gretel, and she pokes her head into the oven, and Gretel pushes her inside and fastens it shut. The witch is burned to death. That releases that tension. And Gretel rescues Hansel from his cage, and that releases more tension. This is the climax. It's the part of the story that resolves the big question or conflict. In this case, how will the children survive? Now, at this point, if Hansel and Gretel merely found their way back home, would the main conflict be resolved? No, because the family is still very poor, and the children would either starve to death or be abandoned again, in which case they would probably still starve to death. So there's more to the story, the resolution. So they search the witch's house, and wouldn't you know it, she's loaded. In every corner are chests full of pearls and jewels. So they take the valuables. They run into another problem crossing a river, but solve that pretty quickly with a duck. Yeah, a duck. And miraculously manage to find their way back home. The father is overjoyed to see them, and, as luck would have it, their stepmother has died. With the witch's jewels to ensure that they never go hungry again, and stepmommy dearest out of the picture, they can all live happily ever after. The final wrap-up of things is the denouement. In some plot structures, you'll see this labeled as just the resolution, or even the conclusion. Those are simpler words most people understand readily, And it doesn't matter that much what you call it, as long as you answer the big question and tie up any loose ends so the reader or viewer feels that the story is finished and a sense of normalcy is restored. So you may be asking, all of this is great for a fairy tale or a novel or even a movie, but what does it have to do with learning scenarios? Well, a story is a story. Scenarios you use in courses will not need the level of detail that appears in a novel or even a short story, but the basic concepts are the same. The build-up and release points that create the rising action and lead to the conflict and resolution, those are your decision points or knowledge checks that keep the learner engaged and keep the story moving forward. Let's look at how this works when you're building a scenario-based lesson. So the exposition part is where you give the learners the information they need to understand the scenario and inform their decision-making. This often happens in a lesson overview or some content that's provided before the scenario. The inciting incident introduces a problem for the learner to solve. This should be a realistic problem the learners may face in their jobs, with consequences in real life if they get it wrong. Now don't make the solution too quick or easy. Think of the choose-your-own-adventure books. Your learning scenarios should work a lot like those. Each choice leads the learner to another choice and works to build the tension a little more. This is the rising action. Correct answers and guiding feedback can release the tension a bit so you can maintain a healthy level for learning. Then, through a series of decision points, or knowledge checks, the learner eventually solves the big problem, the main conflict. This is the climax, and then the situation is resolved. You'll generally have a lesson summary that wraps things up with a nice little bow for the learner. If this structure seems a little complicated to you, you can simplify it. Nancy Duarte boils story structure down to 3 stages she calls situation, complication, and resolution. Tom Coleman of Articulates the Rapid E-Learning blog uses a model for scenario development that he calls the 3 C's: challenge, choice, consequence. In this model, you present the learner with a challenge, he makes a choice, and that choice has a consequence. Each consequence could lead to a new challenge, and you could end up with complex branching. Or you could keep it simple and present the consequences in a feedback box to keep the story linear. Note that this is different from traditional feedback in that you're not just telling the learner, sorry, that's incorrect, you should have chosen X. To make the scenario matter, meaning make it relevant to real life, you should be presenting the results that would happen if an employee made that choice in their job. Also keep in mind that even if you're using a simplified model, the scenario will leave the learner feeling more complete if it builds in complexity and has some sort of pivotal moment where things are resolved in the end. So that's scenario building in a nutshell. Be sure to post your comments and questions.